Good day, eh? This is John Machtemes, and you are listening to the Obry Project Briefs. I'm sure this episode has a number. I've considered numbering these instead of dating these, but until I get to that, the date today is officially February the 23rd, and usually I give the official year in some derogatory form, but I would say that my opinion is the year is probably very close to being just a few centuries from the writing of some of the last books that we know of from the Old Testament, like Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, Haggai, and probably Joel, unless I'm leaving out one or two of the more obscure prophets that we don't really have a solid date on. And now, having dumped that on you, I am going to tell you this is an almost spontaneous episode of Briefs. Not entirely spontaneous, it's a little spontaneous, but it's based on a number of little bits of information that I've been picking up as I've been working on a number of other and very heavily involved projects. What happened was I was listening to one of these old videos. I'll oftentimes listen to when I'm doing document work, and right now I'm completely revising the exhaustive Obry biglyph roots chart because of what I believe was an error I made in interpreting what constitutes a family of roots. And the new way that I'm doing it, I think, is already producing excellent results. It's really involved because you have to basically fill in a small table for every glyph, 22 glyphs, and each glyph would have 22 combinations, basically. And there's various details that have to be filled in for each one of these. Every one of them has to be looked at in context, which was the other mistake that I made. I didn't look at enough of them in context because our good friends at Strong's Concordance has left us with a completely confusing concordance list. They routinely do things like list things that are misspelled, and in a very misleading way, these misspellings. So that's going to take some time, as well as developing material for a sort of subscriber content wing of what I do, and continuing to work very productively on the Bible versus the Middle East book, as well as the translation of Wilhelm Kammeyer's The Falsification of the History of Early Christianity, which is, I think, a tour de force powerhouse book. And it's amazing that he wrote that, which I guess that was taken from a lot of the notes that he had put together on the subject, but also the falsification of the history of the Middle Ages, the falsification of the history of Germany, and a few other smaller things too, only owned by two different publishers, both German publishers. Both I would not trust their motives in wanting to proliferate his material, since none of his work has ever been translated into any other language other than German, and I've looked really long and hard to find. So, lots to do, but I do try to broaden my horizons as much as I can while I do these things. So, I listen to and try to watch a lot of information on the Great Lakes, industry on the Great Lakes, shipping on the Great Lakes. I find out a lot of very strange things about all of that, as well as Periscope film. So Some of you would be familiar with the problem I have with Periscope films is similar to the problem I have with, for instance, local historical societies and private owners of bits of very crucial information that, say, somebody might need if they were researching a topic. Now, I'm not saying that no one has the right to own, for instance, photographs, privately owned photographs, or privately owned certain documents, let's say, business documents, documents that were never part of public domain. I don't know that I can, at this point in time, confidently say maybe they should make that public. I don't know if it's appropriate to say that they shouldn't be holding these things back, because there's so many vital components of our history that are in these private hands and oftentimes not readily shared. And that, to me, that seems to be, look, if they want to share it in the sense that they'll publish it and, here it is, it's in a published form, and you can purchase a copy of all of these things, and then you can have it and use it, or you can use it under licensing. I'm not saying I have necessarily a problem with that, although so much of it, again, has to do with historical facts. And that's where I see the kind of the issue start, is it very much is about historical facts. And the reason that I am so repetitive about this and why it's bothersome to me that I haven't come to a definite opinion on it, because, for instance, I got a book not long ago on Hebrew manuscripts. And in this book, I was shocked to find out how many of these, who knows how old they are, but various manuscripts that were just in private hands, private libraries. It seemed to me that far more were in private hands and not being readily shared, or the sharing very limited. Oftentimes when they're held by museums, again, the sharing of them is extremely limited. Being able to obtain high-quality copies. This is the same problem I encountered when I was researching Mount Rushmore, which, there might be an episode of that in with subscriber content that I begin to create. But when I was researching that, I kept finding all of these images that were very important, valuable images to be able to study in a high-resolution state that, of course, I couldn't obtain. They were being held by the Library of Congress, and the only way that you were able to obtain a high-res or look at, I don't know about obtain, look at high-res copies were basically in person, or you could fill out certain forms and hope that you could, say, attain a really high-quality TIFF, for instance. It's a big issue with me. So it's also a big issue that this Periscope film now is the private owner of a huge amount of propaganda that was, up until just recently, it was owned by the U.S. federal government. Essentially, the story goes that they purchased it from the U.S. federal government because it was deteriorating. It was sitting in these archives, deteriorating. That the U.S. government was just getting ready to destroy it. So they saved it. That's the official story. They saved it because the U.S. government was going to destroy it. God forbid the U.S. government of course, being as poor as they are, they couldn't afford to transfer all that film just into digital and make it available, since if it is a U.S. government film of any kind, it doesn't matter if we're talking about military, commercial, there are all these partnerships that you'll see the U.S. government in with private industry, so-called educational, and on it goes. No matter what it was, to have that available, or actually what I was getting to was because it was produced by, in one way or another, the federal government, it was done, even if it was state governments, it was done with taxpayer dollars. So to take the sheer volume of what it appears was sold to Periscope Film, that was paid for by taxpayer dollars, that is now in private hands, which means if it's in private hands, they have full rights to edit it in any way they see fit and to restrict the use of it by anyone. Now, I'm going to actually try to play a couple of clips from a couple of different films. One published by Periscope Film, that's at Archive. And I was hoping, because it was so brief and that it wasn't directly from YouTube, that there wouldn't be an issue with me publishing it, because it's frequent that I just want to publish a small little clip of something. And, even if you claim the fair use, the law, fair use, I'm showing this for the purposes of critique, criticism. I'm not reproducing this in full to try to profit off of that. That's fair use. That's why there's supposed to be that law, fair use. They'll block it right away and make it a terrible headache for you to petition. Like, look, that's fair use. I was showing that because I was providing a critique. I could see the blocking of the Lynch film. They just demonetized it, which I also think is quite unfair if you're only showing these small clips of any film or piece of created art, and you're using it as an illustration for a point that you derived. They would still entirely remove your monetization. It's ridiculous. So hopefully they go through, because a lot of times things are just entirely blocked. So in the course of considering so many various details that I have to consider, thinking about the world, thinking about the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, I'm not so into calling the New Testament as part of the Old Testament. I know it's in the Bible, and maybe that's the problem, is that those two are associated now, one with the other. It is a serious problem, in my opinion, and I have been arguing a bit now for not even a year about why this is a problem and my problems with the New Testament. But I'm going to be continuing to do so, in part in some of the subscriber content that I'm making, which one of the series will be, let's consider the book of Hebrews. So, when you're trying to put all of this information together, it's all far too big for one person. It's far too much for one person. One person starting after they turn 40. I could say 40 is a good marker, because it is. About when I turn 40, I begin to reconsider all of the things that I took for granted. It's been this very long process for one honest, and I am calling myself an honest man. Not perfect, but honest. Going about this as honestly as I can. It's a huge job. Because not only do you have to reconsider all of those fundamentals that you were taught and programmed fundamentals, you have to try to find a new way to understand everything that harmonizes with reality. Reality that we can observe. This is really important. Reality that we can observe. This is one of the reasons that I spend a lot of time now considering the value of controlling the Great Lakes, the great freshwater seas. At least 20% of the reserves of the freshwater the world over. All the watershed, all the great rivers that drain into the lakes, the entire system that the Great Lakes create. And of course, then all of the major rivers that are connected to the lakes going towards the west a little bit and south via the Illinois River, the Mississippi River, the Calumets, the various rivers in Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, all of those rivers in, say, the Ohio River Valley, and even getting down south of there that can feed into the Mississippi, and then all of the rivers to the east that have these enormous estuaries and great harbors on the eastern coast of the United States, and the links from the Great Lakes to the oceans, not only the Gulf, but the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Lawrence Seaway, and what kind of an amazing economic powerhouse that it is. Now, the funny thing is, I'm almost kind of, I don't want to say beating myself in the head when I realize these things, but I'm sort of chagrined at the fact that I grew up as a Laker. Now, I might have been on the very south tip of Lake Michigan, about 30 miles south of it in a small farming town. But we were ever so aware continually of the presence of the lakes. We visited the lakes all the time. Now I live in the lower peninsula of Michigan, and it is a much, much stronger and more predominant lake culture. However, I don't want anybody to think that it's simply my geographical location. I don't want anyone to think that simply because of the ethnic people I come from, that, well, let's say this, because I think that the lakes are some of the most important resources, if not the most important resource in the world, when you consider everything about them, everything around them, their strategic importance, their industrial importance, their life-sustaining importance, lumber, without getting too much into just everything that the lakes and the watershed of the lakes are loaded with. Not to think that simply because I live near them that there is some sort of geographical pride that I'm exercising. I certainly am not. I'm very thankful I live in a beautiful, productive place. But I don't have some kind of pride about it, like as if me being born here is something like to be proud of. I got the good fortune of being born in a place that I think is a magnificent place, and an old place, and a place of profound worldwide and historical importance. I just happen to be there. That's fantastic. Same thing with ethnic history. I am ethnically what would be just considered a poor German from that area. And for the longest time, my mom's side of the family would just call themselves part Scotch-Irish, which was just, again, a term, just another way of saying a Celt. Because, again, not wealthy people. My mother's maiden name, not a name that's predominant that you'll find much at all. Surname, same with my surname. But because I have that history, and because I also have found in my looking, though this is not confirmation bias, I was not trying to say, well, let's see if me and my people, my ethnicity, and my history, if I can somehow force that to line up with important peoples or important events or important places, because I know a lot of people exercise confirmation bias, no matter if it's themselves, their family history, the place where they're from. This is something that is done all the time. I am not that sort of, I suppose, patriotic, proud soul, in the sense that I don't see myself linked with the place that I'm at in that kind of sense of pride, or the people that I come from. Here's the thing. The surnames on either side can be seen as Germanic, Celtic surnames. And I think that there's probably more evidence of Germanic, Celtic, since both of them were referred to, well, the Germanic and Gauls both were referred to as Celts, that they're a very similar people. And they have the most evidence of being the historic Israelites and Judahites. That being said, who knows where I came from tribally on both my mother and father's side. It could turn out that I'm who knows, some kind of Canaanite. I could turn out to be whatever, tribally and ethnically. And it really wouldn't change the things that I've learned and the things that I so far believe. Now, I did say that because it's really important. If I'm talking a lot about the place where I live and all the locations near the place I live, I happen to live in the midst of these so-called lakes, in the midst of such a fertile, beautiful place. And I happen to come from two people who I believe that I've found over the years to be the best candidates for the Israelites and the Judahites from the Bible. I would say this, even though a lot of people do practice this confirmation bias, just because that is the case, I don't think that it should be considered a given that that's what I'm doing. I just happen to be of these ethnicities. I just happen to live where I live. I just happen to live at the time I live in. And I'm doing my best to be as honest as I can. What if I found out along the way I was from some other ethnicity? I wasn't from the tribe of Judah. I wasn't from the house of Israel. I was a Hittite, or I guess I'll use transliterations, a Hivite, a Jebusite. I found out I was an Ashuri or whatever. Again, it really wouldn't change what I believe as far as my worldview is, one. Secondly, I would, like many of the people that we see throughout the Old Testament, I would really actually want to simply link myself with this people who I believe are a people, obviously, as we see recorded in the Bible, just chosen for a special purpose of being an example to the other nations of the world. Plain and simple. And I think they ultimately have a very good, fruitful, and productive destiny to fulfill. Not people that are better than. I think this people that we're looking at in Judah and Israel are probably some of the most average people of their race that there are. Why would Yahweh pick someone who was prettier, brighter, taller, smarter, better, the best of their kind? I just am not seeing him being all that glorified if he chose the best of a certain kind. So this kind of speaks against these Christian identity people out there who claim that Israel is white. So you can do the math on that and figure out how that would just be strange, because you would expect him to pick basically somebody who was more of a mediocre, So I had to get that out of the way because I've noticed that over the years, people with their confirmation bias and people that seem to want to believe themselves to be special. They want to believe that they're from a super special genealogy of people, or they live in a super special place, or something super special. And I don't need that, because I already feel that I am super blessed in the work that I'm able to do. I don't need those other things. And if you pay close attention to the Bible, it's simply not only the Israelites and the Judahites that Yahweh oftentimes has close relationships with. So there's no reason to have to follow after these CI types, these types that convince you that you're more special if you're from a certain race or certain ethnicity or anything of the such. So, now that said, interesting thing as components start seeming to emerge. I'm finding out all these things about the Great Lakes that not only did no one teach me growing up in the shadow of the lakes, not only did nobody really teach me, it's not out there in the public mind. They say they average, this is like different quote-unquote experts have averaged anywhere from 3,000, which is like the lowest low number figure you'll get, to the more official 6,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes since, since they say Western sailing began, which would be about the 1670s. Now, the last real shipwreck on the lakes was the 1970s. So that's 300 years of maritime travel on the Great Lakes. They say that 3,000 is a seriously low number. 6,000 is about what a lot of people will tell you. And of course, 4,500, you'll hear that a lot too, right in the middle. So what does that tell us? That tells us that there would be somewhere around 20 per year for all 3 centuries. And then all of a sudden in 1975, no more. Done. So there's some really odd things about the lakes. The stories of how ships have wrecked are very strange. Very, very strange stories. The fact that there's no major movies about these harrowing shipwrecks on the lakes. Harrowing shipwrecks on the lakes. There's a number of channels that actually specialize in maritime disasters, shipwrecks on the lakes, and other pretty amazing stories on the lakes. No major movie, no shows, no anything like that regarding the lakes. The only show I've even found about the Great Lakes themselves was a series with, I think, 2 seasons produced by MTV. The most boring thing I've seen. It's like Prozac on film or something. And it seems to me that, being produced by something like MTV of all things, that it's absolutely calculated to make us really bored. with the Great Lakes. Very, very bored with the Great Lakes. Like stories that the beaver pelt was the economic engine that drove trade on the lakes for just about 2 centuries. These things are beyond reasonable to comprehend. The Great Lakes, not only at least 20% of all the fresh water in the world, which there's a system you can work out where life thrives more depending on what base elements and flora are flourishing in given places. And the Great Lakes have some of the highest concentrations of that in the world, barely ever mentioned. The amount of iron ore, the Mesabi mines in Minnesota, at least 90 miles long stretches of these vast open pit surface mines where they've literally just been pulling iron right from the surface straight up and out for at least a century. Now, they say they started mining the Mesabi around the same time as that first huge Bethlehem steel plant in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was started. So you can believe that if you choose to. Of course, this isn't just about iron, but iron and the iron mines and the steel-making industry on the 5 Great Lakes is, I believe, from what I've seen, the hands down, without any competition, the most prolific sources of the production of steel and other just all different forms of steel, the different kinds of mills and what they produce throughout all of the Great Lakes is mind-blowing when you start looking into all of the mills, their size, their scale, what they produce, because this is the best location to do it, is on the lakes, because all of the resources that are needed to do so are all easily acquired from around the lakes. The great iron mines in Minnesota, and then down through Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula, and who knows where else iron is that they haven't even started pulling from yet, that they don't want us to know about. There could be highly concentrated iron deposits all over the place they really don't want us to know about. The closure of iron mines in the UP in Wisconsin, the stories about why they closed are so dubious. The story about why the copper mines of Keweenaw are extremely dubious, and the silver mines up northern Superior. And keep in mind, these people that try to sell you a dream by telling you that there's value in gold and silver. There's no value in gold and silver if you can't wear it, put it over your head to give you shelter, or eat it, or use it to dominate someone else that has all those resources. That's what has value. So besides all of these metals, and there's zinc mining and other mining in Wisconsin, the UP, Minnesota, other states, Canada, the lumber industry between Canada and Wisconsin and Michigan is beyond your imagination. But of course, all they really want us to think about and talk about in the U.S. is the lumber industry on the West Coast. The farming industry, all of the agriculture, all the grain that is shipped out of ports in the Great Lakes up north, because that's where such a proliferation of grain comes from, is the north and around the lakes. But they want you to think of fields out in the west on the plains. They come out of harbors in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, Michigan, Canada. Natural gas, maybe oil. Again, the fresh water. This is not something to take lightly. The amount of springs in Michigan is so prolific, I can't even begin to try to keep track of them all. Perfectly clean water, springs everywhere. That's just Michigan. So anyone who controlled all of it, anyone who controlled a piece of it, would be an empire and a people very formidable indeed. Anyone who controlled it all would be beyond formidable, and also, if they were quite intelligent and they were a bit concerned that maybe a lot of those people who lived all around this, in my opinion, again, based on everything I've seen, the highest concentration of resources the world over is around the Great Lakes, and specifically the eastern seaboard of the United States. If you know of a higher concentration of resources anywhere in the world, you let me know. If you controlled all of that, you would certainly not want the people who lived all around it to have the first clue. The poor people that lived all around it, the people who lived and died on the lakes for what? A decent salary, whether it be in the steel mills, the gas refineries, working on the lake freighters, the lumber industry. These are people that work hard and live hard lives, oftentimes living in hard environments. The environment around Superior, northern Lake Michigan, northern Huron, Erie, they're harsh environments. You would certainly not want those people to know that you were controlling all of that and that you were wealthy beyond anyone's imagination, that you controlled commodities and commodity prices, and they might as well, it didn't matter how much gold and silver they had, because you're controlling the iron, you're controlling the lumber, you're controlling the grain, you're controlling all of these resources utterly vital for people's basic survival. You're controlling all of this fresh water, so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. You wouldn't want them to know that you have this full control of it, and that they're living oftentimes very meager lives on these lands that you're controlling. And you would probably do about anything that was necessary to draw people's attention away from that, so that they didn't find out, especially in record numbers, in some sort of a corporate way, what was going on. Given that I've said all of that, there's still more. There's still more. I'm not trying to suggest that the area at the south end of Lake Michigan is a specific city, part of a specific empire seen in the Bible, but there are some eerily interesting things about it. Just for one, the area of Chicago, the whole greater metropolitan area, it controls one of the most important choke points of all that industry and economy, which is the southern western exit and entrance into the Illinois River, into the Mississippi River, out to the Gulf, back and forth, controls all of that. And then you have, starting right at the edge of Chicago, the border of Illinois, then you have all of the industry, including what used to be called, now it's under different names, and they literally say this Indian steel magnate owns it. Are you kidding me? Anyways, so traditionally, my young life, the first large one was known as Inland Steel, and then the next large one, Inland was like Whiting, East Chicago, sort of Hammond area. The next large one, a little more spread out maybe, was U.S. Steel. It was the Gary Works of U.S. Steel. They also have one, at least one other, up in Minnesota. And then after that, you had Burns Harbor steel mills, which was Bethlehem, Burns Harbor, Bethlehem. Most of Indiana's shoreline covered in these enormous steel mills, very industrial, with that Chicago control of all of this shipping in and out. That is a place that you would want to control. If you were somebody who wanted to control and have power, you'd want to control that. So, that being said, again, I don't want you to think that I'm necessarily saying that Chicago or that area was a specific place that we see in the Bible. However, I wouldn't be surprised if it were, on the other hand. So this brings us to a specific story from the Bible. The rough part about this is it is a story from the book of Daniel. Now, I don't want anybody to get the idea that I disregard the book of Daniel. I'm not saying I disregard the book of Daniel, okay? I'm saying that there's some issues with the book of Daniel. There's a couple of issues with the book of Daniel. Part of it is the way that it's written. It's written a little bit scatterbrained. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. But of course, 2 of the chapters have already been removed because of how obviously kind of ridiculous they were. One was Susanna, and the other one was Belle and the Dragon. They're a little silly. A little bit. But the thing is, I'm not saying that the whole book is not necessarily scripture. It's not what I'm implying. And here's the thing. If it were one of those books, and I think there are a couple of books, especially Esther, that was inserted into the Old Testament narrative to give us a very different, a very skewed, maybe a very incorrect worldview or view of people. And Esther is one book that really does that. Esther is far more in line with apocryphal literature than the Old Testament, the Law and Prophets. I'm not saying Daniel is, no. It's just a little bit different than the other books of prophecy. So it's just one of those books that I'm kind of keep on one of those sort of radars, like, I'm always just kind of considering it. However, whether it is entirely inspired or whether there's some problems with it, even apocryphal books that I think are not inspired, I don't know if I would say at all. We can still learn things because at some point in time, these people that are secretly ruling the world did introduce those apocryphal books into the canon. In my opinion, they introduced the New Testament onto the Law and Prophets to entirely mislead us. The whole purpose of the Law and Prophets. They want us to see the Law and Prophets through this New Testament, quote-unquote, revelation. So there are still things to learn, no matter if it's absolutely inspired or not. And the thing I was thinking about when I'm listening to these old films on shipping and these old films on industry and these old films on iron ore and these old films on the steel mills all around the lakes and, of course, the steel mills of the Indiana Harbor, which are a pretty amazing thing, in Chicago. And it struck me, now this is very interesting. I started thinking about the whole story of Daniel 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the statue, the image that they wouldn't bow down to, what happened to them, and some of the details. Now, I'm going to read part of this, and I'm not saying that I necessarily believe. First off, this is part of Daniel, from Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, until the end of Daniel chapter 7. That is all written in what they call Aramaic, though it is all written in quote-unquote Hebrew characters. It's that, as far as I'm concerned, what they call biblical Aramaic is some sort of an odd ad hoc language. I don't know how yet it was put together, but it was sort of put together basically by using Obri terms. Now, I don't know if this was actually a language that was used by a neighboring tribe, or if this is kind of like, in my opinion, Koine Greek or English, which is actually very much a almost entirely contrived language. But you have to understand that. So some of the terms we aren't going to be able to be very confident in being able to compare with the rest of the Bible, because there's these very small sections of the Bible that are actually written in what they call biblical Aramaic. This is one of them. And the only others that exist are a couple of little excerpts from letters, which are recounted in Ezra and Nehemiah. And that's about it. So we don't have this huge pool of information that we can compare terms. But the thing is, everything's going to fall apart if they don't keep at least some things, at least the basic form of some things, intact. But just consider this. So it says in Daniel 3:1, it says that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, the breadth 6 cubits. Interesting. That's 60. The breadth is 6. And he set it up in the plain, they say it's called the plain of Dura, in the province of Babel. I just say that's interesting because did you know that the basic building proportions for Great Lakes ships is 10-1. So like the 600-foot class, that was the most prolific cargo carriers, they were about 600 feet long and about 60 feet wide. That was the basic proportions. It's just interesting that this, they're saying it's an image, and they're saying it's of gold. Is because they're using the same kind of units here when they say cubit and cubit. And I don't know what a cubit is or was supposed to be. There's a lot of speculation. They'll say it's anywhere from 12 to 18 inches, and I don't know that. You know, we don't have any way of really confirming that, but we're supposed to believe it is a statue anywhere from 60 to 90 feet high, which would be pretty big. It wouldn't be the biggest thing. It'd be pretty big, though. And they're saying 6 cubits across, so 6 to 9 feet across. Now that sounds more like if it were a vertical structure, certainly not a statue, because nobody has that. That's not proportions of a statue. That's, you know, if you took a Laker, like the ones they say they built in the first decade of the 19th century, which I think those Lakers are actually hundreds of years old, because the fresh water doesn't corrode them like saltwater ships. That's basically if you stood one on end and you saw how long they are in comparison with their beam or their width, that's the same proportions right there. So it doesn't sound like a statue to me. In fact, I would be more prone to believing that it was, if it were something that was set up, something more like maybe an obelisk, or on a pillar with a statue at the top, because of the proportions they're giving us here. That's Laker proportions. Anyways, then it says, then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and the rulers of the provinces. Remember, this is all being translated from so-called Aramaic words. We don't know exactly what the roots, and I'm not going to go through the roots of these words just now, to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So it goes on to repeat itself. It says, the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image. It's Tsalema, or Tsalamat, is the quote-unquote Aramaic word that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then an herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of a cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music. They actually spell it M-U-S-I-C-K, almost music. You fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And I'm not sure what kind of burning fiery furnace they would have in the location where they say Babylon was, between the Tigris and Euphrates. To heat water. What are we doing? We're baking bricks. Not going to be a huge furnace. Daniel 3:7 continues, therefore at that time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. My goodness. First off, can we at least try to view the problems in translation based on what we can understand about people in reality? In reality, it would serve the king not at all to do something like this, to set up anything where he commanded that when all people hear some kind of music, they have to stop what they're doing and worship, as they're saying here in English, worship whatever this thing is. In reality, that does not serve the king at all. And it wouldn't serve any of all of his governors and everything. The first thing that's going to happen is all of these officials, when they realize that he has built something and he's going to decree that everybody has to worship it when they hear music, they are going to start talking amongst themselves. They're going to start saying there's something wrong with him. There's something seriously wrong with him. And they're going to start saying, if we enforce this. By the way, why would he call all of these officials from all these different provinces if he had set up one thing in one place and tell them all that they were to enforce that? The fuck do they care if they're in some province that's 100 miles away? But the thing is, they're going to start talking, and they're going to start saying, these people who aren't mindless imbeciles are going to see this law as what it is. Crazy. This should be one of the signs that we're getting some kind of a translation that's really bad. Something amiss is going on here, because this does not sound like something that can logically be translated into reality. See, kings cannot just rule with an iron hand like this. The people are going to get tired of their insanity, because this would be just an absolute example of unbridled insanity. They're going to get tired of it, and some shit's going to go down. It's going to go down. You see, that's why the people who control the most resource-rich place and places on the earth, they have to do it through lies and deception. They have to convince us that we're free and we have a constitution. We vote for people that actually do things. You see, it's on us. It's not on them. They have to do it that way because they want to stay in power. They don't want us to see all of their oftentimes insane things that they do. And I'm not saying that these are just like insane psychopaths. In fact, I think they're very intelligent. And I think that they believe that the system that they're using was devised for very good reason. I think they believe that they are the victors of one or a number of wars and conflicts. They have every right to rule the things that they rule, and that the reason that they do it all by deception and in secrecy is absolutely necessary, because if they did not, the barbaric people that they rule over would ruin everything and cast it all into chaos. I believe that they truly are the good guy in their scenario, and they may have a lot of points for why they are, in fact. This is why I said I really want my worldview to be much more in harmony with what we can ascertain about reality and people and the way that the world works. Yeah. But continuing the story, it said then, wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Judahites, of course, not the Jews, it's the Yehudim, Judahites. They spake and they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, don't say it, sack, but psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worship, he should be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Judahites whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, let's get into reality. I believe that the only terms under which a king would set these foreign people, like these probably very well-educated men of Judah that he had taken some time before, that he would train them and set them over affairs, it would probably be only in a, how should I say, in a somewhat quasi-diplomatic role, dealing with the affairs of their own people, and that they would be directly under other supervisors. That's the only way I could ever see them being any sort of officials in the kingdom. Even Daniel, I think it's wrong to assume that he would be given a lot of power or prestige very quickly. That not seeing any kind of king, ruler, or anything giving any of these people too much power. But obviously, as we see as like a theme, at least in Daniel, and I think probably some other books if we looked at it, but see, in Daniel, the Judahites are actually in another country. They're surrounded by other people who are not Judahites. They're not Israelites, in a foreign land, and they aren't liked very much. Go figure. Sounds familiar. Sounds like some other people I know. See, it says, then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are actually names that are, they're Kajdi names. Kajdi, Kajdim, Cassidy. These are the people that actually rule. It's not Babylonians. One of the provinces is Babel. I think another one of the provinces is Shushan. So we'll see that also in Daniel, Shushan. But, and others, because we see all of them as part of this area, often called Shinar, and which could include Oilam and other places. So anyways, they were given different names. These are not their Oberi or Udim names. They were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, he says, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Did you not serve my gods nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if you be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the, cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer," could you see some dulcimer music? All of a sudden, you're just doing your thing. You're walking down the street. You're minding your own business. You're eating something kosher. And all of a sudden, here comes the dulcimer. Some chick in a craft store is playing your hammer dulcimer, and now you got to fall down and worship this apparently a golden image, which is of very odd proportions. Anyways, all kinds of music. You fall down. Are you ready to fall down and worship the image that I've made? But if you do not worship, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is it that God shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered, and they said, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer thee in this matter," as in they're not going to guard what they say. They're going to be very straightforward. "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not," and that's such an important part of this whole story, whatever we can trust about it, that's such an important part of this story. That's such an important part. When they say, but if not, that's the important part right there, because it's with that they really tell him, we mean business. But if not, be it known to thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Even if he doesn't deliver us, we're not going to worship it. Yeah. So it goes on to say, then Nebuchadnezzar, full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it wont to be heated, so very hot. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. So then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, their lederhosen, and their hats. They just bound them all up in all of their garments. And their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonied. He was astonied. I think he was astonished, and rose up in haste, spake and said unto his counselors, "Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said unto the king, "True, O king." And he answered and said, "Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." It's like the Son of God. See, it's Jesus. Actually, Bar Alayin, which in this ad hoc Aramees, I guess it's supposed to be same as the Hebrew Alim. The whole thing with Bar, we don't have enough to compare it to in Aramaic, so it would be a little bit difficult to say absolutely. That's why some translations actually have him saying it looks like a son of the gods, or a god, or something like that. Okay, so it says he's looking in this furnace and he sees 4 figures and they're not hurt. And he's freaked out. And it says he came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and he spake to them. And he said, "Servants of the Most High God, come forth." And they came. And this is where he gives this decree that anyone who speaks against their God, that they would be thrown into the furnace, and so on and so forth. Now, here's the thing about the whole story. Well, if you have a furnace, and there's really not many furnaces that I can think of that would be useful in Mesopotamia, if Babylon was in Mesopotamia. Maybe a brick kiln. That's a kiln. But okay. We'll regard that as a furnace. Because kilns are made in very similar ways. You know, they're lined with a type of fire brick, and they're heated to great heats in order to transform clay into brick or porcelain or pottery or so on and so forth. Yeah. Maybe we're talking about a kiln. You think it's a kiln? You put them in a kiln? I don't know. I don't know that it's ever claimed that they had, serious kilns there, but I think mud brick would be out of the question too, because we can see as early as Genesis chapter 11 that wherever they were in this place, Shinar, that they were already starting to use very advanced techniques for things that they were doing. Now, we could believe it was a brick furnace. The one big problem would be what they were using for fuel. I'm not aware of any large coal deposits or that they were refining gases in any way, shape, or form. But this idea of heating it, first off, 7 times as high as normal, it's not going to work no matter what kind of furnace, in my opinion. Because furnaces are designed typically to be used in a certain heat range. The fire bricks that they're lined with, the way that it's designed, okay, and if it was designed to be at a certain maximum heat, 7 times more, there's serious problems with not only Oberi or Hebrew numbers, but obviously Aramaic numbers too. That doesn't make a lot of sense. The 7 times. Now, a bit hotter, okay. But again, he sounds kind of like a psychopath, because I don't know of any furnace that you would be using as a furnace to make anything that the standard heat wouldn't be okay. I just kind of think that the wording here that they're translating as heat 7 times more is wrong. And it doesn't matter what context that you put it in. Now, there's an interesting thing about the size of a furnace that you could put people in, where you would have a culture where they would have furnaces that big that would actually have the accoutrements to allow someone to not only cast people into them, but to look inside and to watch them, because obviously he's watching this happen. He has men who are ordered to, they would have to physically take and throw them in, because they're not going to be able to put them in any other way, I suppose. I mean, there's a lot of different ways, maybe not. But this is just a thought concerning this kind of furnace and what our possibilities are. Now, there's a lot of different furnaces out there. You'll see that when you look them up. But one of the greatest amounts of proliferations of types of furnaces are furnaces that you're going to find in the actual steel making process and in foundries. And to a lesser extent, forges too, different kinds of furnaces. Your largest furnaces are going to be found typically at steel mills, where they're actually taking the iron, the coal, they're making into coke and sinter, the limestone, dolomite, and all that. They're making pig iron, and then they're taking pig iron and they are making that into an alloy known as steel, and there's all different kinds of steel that you can make. Now, I want to show this quick clip from an old movie that is, again, a sort of a propaganda movie, and this is actually called The Drama of Steel. I'm just going to play a short bit of this, and what I want you to pay attention to is they're going to start at the blast furnace, but then they're going to take the molten pig iron and they're going to transport it over to where they have the open hearth furnace. There's a few different kinds of furnaces used to create the steel alloy after the blast furnace, but one of the most popular ones has been for a very long time before they went to like arc and other types of basic oxygen steel making is open hearth. So just check this out real quick.
Every 4 or 5 hours, the tapping hole is opened and out rushes a glowing stream of molten iron, termed in the industry hot metal. Sometimes this hot metal is poured into molds and the resulting pig iron shipped to foundries for castings. But usually the fiery river pours through channels which lead it over the tapping floor to huge ladles which hold 125 to 150 tons of hot metal. But before this becomes steel, it must be further refined. So let's take a look at the open hearth department. 90% of all steel today is produced in the open hearth furnaces. Are you noticing,
first off, how big, how extensive this open hearth furnace setup is? The open hearth furnace is this huge, depending on the size of the mill, I suppose, and how much they want to refine a steel, and how many different, how many different individual sections of the furnace they would have set up for making the different specifications as far as alloys go, which they might actually have something like that, because as you can see in this, for instance, we don't know which mill this is, but this is enormous. I mean, this could be something like an Inland, this could be a U.S. Steel, this could be a Bethlehem. I mean, the size of it, absolutely. And you have all of these guys who are basically, they're just shoveling various amounts of like limestone they'll put in there, because the limestone is even in the secondary process of making the alloy, limestone is used both in the blast furnace and in basic oxygen steel making, because it's still combining with those impurities and making slag. They're going to pull slag off of this too. But what you'll see is there's all these doors in this open hearth furnace, and these guys, they all have to protect themselves. They're typically wearing fire gear, or as time went on, they wore better fire gear instead of, just aprons and things like that. And they would just try to get in and get out. They might open one door and need a certain amount of shovelfuls thrown into that part of it right there. And you would have 4 or 5 guys, and they would just go in kind of a line, quickly throwing these shovelfuls in. And they would typically all be wearing at least kinds of glasses that would protect their eyes. That's what's important, is because I don't care what kind of furnace it is, and if you have it hot enough, it's creating so much heat, you're not going to be able to look at it because it's that bright. You start creating these these high temperatures of heat, and the fire brick and the molten steel, it's all so hot that it gets so bright that you have to wear special glasses to look and see what's going on. In fact, in some of the other like older, well, kind of depends on the environment, but there's plenty where the guys who are monitoring what's going on, they'll stand behind a shield and they'll have a special interesting sort of little slit in the shield, and they'll look at everything in a certain way through that slit, and they're trying not to look directly at it, and they'll wear protective glasses too. But I'm just giving you a sense of how big a place like this is and how readily somebody could just be tossed into this furnace and they're gone, and they'd be gone pretty fast. I would have to say, all things considered, that this might actually be a relatively merciful way compared to a lot of like maybe more brutal and savage ways that you could kill somebody. You throw them into that molten steel in an open hearth furnace. I'm not saying it'd be pleasant at all, but from the minute they hit the surface, shock is going to just almost instantly shock. I mean, before they have time to scream a lot, really. They're going to catch on fire. They're going to be dead so fast. Once they breathe the air that's in there, they're going to be dead so fast. So I don't know. But here is a situation where you can actually see something like this playing out. And there's only a little bit more of this that I will play.
Because of the demand for tailor-made steel in large quantities, which can be produced with this flexible and efficient method. The nearly human charging machine dumps a box of limestone into the furnace and withdraws for another load. The limestone removes impurities from the steel. In similar manner, the furnace is charged with a predetermined amount of scrap metal. As the scrap is already refined steel, it's a helpful ingredient. Lastly, a giant overhead crane brings a huge ladle of hot metal as it comes from the blast furnace. The usual charge is about half scrap steel and half blast furnace iron. An open hearth furnace consists of what might be termed an upstairs and a downstairs. Upstairs is the hearth, in which the steel-making materials are refined. Downstairs are heating chambers containing fire brick, laid in checkerboard pattern. One chamber for heating the fuel, which may be oil, gas, or oil and tar, and another chamber for heating air. The preheated air and fuel move upward, pass into the space above the hearth. Combustion instantly takes place. Currents of flaming fuel sweep over the hot metal, creating temperatures as high as 3,000 degrees. Excess carbon and impurities are burned out. The hot exhaust gases pass down through another set of checker chambers, heating the bricks as they pass between them. Every 15 minutes, the direction of flow of the fuel and air is reversed. In this way, air and gas are heated in one set of chambers, while hot exhaust gases are heating the others. This operation continues for 9 to 12 hours. In the door of the furnace is a peephole through which the melter in charge observes the heat. Let's borrow his colored glasses and peer inside at the boiling, bubbling steel.
See, so you can barely see all of that molten steel on that black and white camera because it's just so bright. So they've got these little holes that they're actually going to peer through, and you'll see the guy is not only wearing glasses that are really, really heavily tinted, but he's also peering through it at an angle, and he's using his arm to shield a certain amount of that brightness. It's something. But you could, if you had the right glasses, and maybe They used to make glasses that were far better at protecting the eyes and the face, that you could look in there and see what was going on. I mean, I don't know exactly how long that went on for, as far as how badly these men and women, lots of women, at these mills that they were using like slaves, who maybe thought they were kind of free. Maybe they thought they were free. It's hard to say how long they treated them as shitty as they did before they really had to develop this idea of them being protected through unions and all of that, which all of that kind of developed around the same time as a lot of what we see in our modern world sort of developed too. But this would be a situation where you would have a furnace large enough. You're not going to heat it 7 times, 2,500 to 3,000 degrees. No. It's not going to happen. It's a bad translation, or it's ridiculous. Besides for your basic oven that you have at home that you're going to bake things in, there's really not that many industrial furnaces, which, what do you think he's going to throw them in? It's going to be some sort of large industrial furnace. It's not made to go 7 times whatever its average heating temperature is. That whole command, the way it's translated, is not harmonious with reality. But this is a situation, this is a perfect situation for him to say that he's going to, toss people into a furnace. And you got to think about that. If it was a furnace, that was the form of death that these people who refused to do whatever this thing is. I'm telling you, I don't think this translation is really relaying to us whatever is going on here. Statue, I don't know. Muzak, there's got to be something. There would have to be something appropriate. Think about that. Appropriate with this idea that if there were people, maybe it wasn't everybody. Maybe this was some kind of policy that he said he gathered all these people together, and then you think, well, what would these people from all these other far off provinces give a shit? If he made a statue in his province, they don't have to worry about it. But maybe that's not what the story is. Maybe once we find out what this so-called Aramaic was really saying, he called those officials from all those different provinces that he controlled. And he told them that this law he was passing, like we see today, by the way, the laws that the federal government of the United States, for instance, passes, those laws, policies, are for employees of the federal government or employees of the state government. It's just that they've gotten us to the point to where most people are employees or in contract with, in one way or another, the federal government. So that's why you have to abide by their rules. Again, not being open about this, but we'll say he was. Back then, these people were a little bit more open about the fact that they ruled other people. I don't know when that all changed. Probably just within the last few hundred years. So maybe he gets them all together because whatever this is that he's doing, this applies to government employees. And maybe it has little to nothing to do with music playing or bowing down to a statue. I guess time, hopefully, will sort out those problems with the translation. However, if we're talking about people actually being thrown into a furnace, so here's the thing. People that are government employees, state employees, whatever, a lot of them, they're real power-hungry, spineless shits. A lot of them. And they will oftentimes do just about damn near anything that the guy in charge tells them to do if it will keep their place in government, because they have such soft fucking lives. They do. A couple houses, toys, mistress or two, the ability to support large families, really good health care, so on and so forth. The finer things in life. And they'll do just about anything. Maybe that's why they hated those three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they didn't give a shit about all of those cares that all of those other government employees cared about. So they wanted to get rid of them. Thrown into the furnace is an interesting part of that. That ought to, you would think, I don't know, I would think. Either it had something directly to do with whatever this situation is, this law that Nebuchadnezzar had passed. Or, I don't know. Or maybe the furnace was such an integral part of this people's culture that there was something symbolic about not being put to death, but being thrown into specifically a furnace. Something to think about. It's stuff to think about. Now, just in case showing that little clip doesn't get my video suspended, limited, blocked, or demonetized, I have one more that I think is just bizarre. I ran across it the other day. So these are old propaganda news clips that Periscope Film produces. This was supposedly produced in about the 1930s, though it's talking about a story of the U.S. military occupying Gary, Indiana, because there were strikers, a lot of them being women, because you need the military when there's a lot of women on strike. And I guess there had been one or more explosions at the mill that they were blaming on probably disgruntled workers. Now, how often have we heard stories like that? They're terrorists, right? And they have to send in troops to protect the interests of the nation, national security, so on and so forth, from terrorists who are blowing up vital things or destroying vital things when we know they're really the ones that are doing it. And of course, they're passing more laws or more draconian measures on us under the pretext that they're protecting something. But that's not it. This is the strange thing. And this is really just the tail end of the video. This is one of the longest briefs I've probably ever done. It's about almost an hour and a half now. This is supposed to be being filmed in Gary, Indiana, so right outside of the U.S. Steelworks. I'm very familiar with this area. The U.S. Steel, the bridge that they show, where the South Shore Line runs. I'm very familiar with this area. I've been up here countless times, rode the South Shore by here countless times. They show a scene of a street that goes down to and terminates before we see a couple of, and I'm calling them in my posts on Facebook, rolling mills, though they could be a number of different forming mill buildings that we're looking at. But those buildings are your basic sort of, forming mills buildings. Those buildings are really huge, by the way. They just don't look that big when you see them in the context of these huge operations, which are known as steel mills. And you see them next to blast furnaces or just near blast furnaces. And blast furnaces are, anywhere from 100 plus to 300 feet high. So sometimes they don't look as big, but they're freaking big, huge buildings. And I want you to pay attention. You'll have to look at the video now if you're not. I want you to pay attention to the structure that you see behind the rolling mill on the right in this upcoming scene, because I'm here to tell you I don't recall ever seeing anything remotely like what I'm looking at here out in this harbor, this U.S. Steel harbor. And when you consider things like the White City, Chicago, that whole area of what Chicago once looked like not that long ago, and how much it's been changed deliberately, and how many vestiges of this place that once existed in a certain way have been demolished or changed, destroyed. You really have to wonder what we are looking at behind this rolling mill. I'm going to go ahead and play it. I'm going to mute my mic while I play it so that the audio comes through better.
At Indiana Harbor, streets are lined with idle workers and patrolling pickets. And there's trouble.
Did you see it back there? I'm going to rewind it again and play it one more time.
Picket lines composed of women. At Indiana Harbor, streets are lined with idle workers.
See it back there? I'm going to back it up just a little bit. There we go. It's not quite middle frame. Now it's kind of middle frame. So you have a street. I haven't identified the street. But if you look at U.S. Steel, Indiana Harbor. Right now unfortunately, I'm in Bay City. Just looking at some things on the Saginaw River. So you just go in here to Indiana. And of course, whenever I really want to go and look at something on Google Maps, it's not wanting to respond. It must be the cabal. They know I'm making this video, so my computer isn't working right. I wonder when people are going to stop trying to use that bullshit one, like they're doing an interview and things seem to be like glitching. They're saying, oh, there they are. They're messing with our signals. So this is pretty close to... They've changed plenty, of course, in the last 100 years. But you see this stadium right here? This is a Railcat Stadium. So about 3-4 blocks in front of the Railcat Stadium, you're going to have Broadway. And that's going to head straight north a little ways, up right into the mills. Now, before they had all of this extra, like the parking and the other things on the other, I guess just before the Grand Calumet River, things probably looked quite a bit different. See, you have more of these rolling mill type buildings further and further out. And you can even go kind of further and further towards the town of Miller, and you're still going to have all kinds of industry, parts of the mill, different foundries, forges, portions of the mill, so on and so forth. And there's a lot of areas where in the past the residential districts and the basic commercial districts were far closer. Okay? So they're showing basically a scene wherein you would see these. I got the 3D on. And it might actually be a scene very close to where, because all of these mills have their own sort of internal towns, industry, like basically places where you can go, businesses where you can go and get various things that you might need or want. Probably what we're looking at in that video. This one right here. When we see this street, and then we see what looks to be maybe a high wall or something back here. And then we see these rolling mill buildings that I'm calling rolling mill buildings back here. And if I looked into it harder and harder and harder, I could probably get close to defining what it is, because I don't think any of these structures have really changed all that much as far as the basic form. That's not the whole issue. The issue here is, if you look at this, and I'll play it one more time from start to the finish of the scene so you can see that there is a parallax. You can make out the roof on this one mill building right here, and notice that it's in front of whatever this thing, this huge thing in the background is. That is not a blast furnace. That is not a blast furnace, and that is one structure that has some sort of a dark feature on the right as I look at it, and on the left, and that it is stepping up. Looks very much, if I could see the top of it, it almost seems like it was something that would look Art Deco-y. Or, God, or it's not a structure like a building with different materials employed, but it's literally something that has one enormous member in the foreground, and then something going back this way to another one in the rear. Whatever that is, I'm telling you, I don't know what that is, but it is huge. It's friggin' huge. And there's so much about this country, the Great Lakes region, because it's so valuable. It's so coveted by the people who control it. They're so willing to continue to control it and the people around it, especially the people that they see as the most threatening, through any means necessary, including lying, of course, mostly including lying about who lives here, how fast all of this was built and developed, and under what circumstances. None of it, of course, adding up. I'm going to play that one more time, and then I'm going to cut this off. I'm past an hour and a half. It's crazy, man. So one more time so you can get a good view of whatever that is in the back here behind these rolling mills. And whatever you think it is, let me know in the comments. One more time.
At Indiana Harbor, streets are lined with idle workers and patrolling pickets. And there's trouble brewing behind this.
So actually, you see that's an inland steel building. It could be inland steel. Doesn't really matter if it was inland or U.S. steel. Because look, I'll show you Indiana Harbor. So with Indiana Harbor, you got Bethlehem. The whole Bethlehem complex is over here. We've got various industry in between the two. A little bit more industry just over here before we get into like the Dunes National Lakeshore. Then we got U.S. Steel, this huge right here. Huge area in operation. And then down here, excuse me, down here you have inland, what we used to call inland steel right here. Now this would be a place that would be a little bit more likely that you would see streets, commercial streets and so on and so forth, you know, sort of merging. And this is where you would have this huge harbor. This one right here that comes in. A big old harbor. And look at this complex, the way this is set up, with these canals shooting off in these different directions, merging with the river right here. See it? Yeah, it's really something. And yeah, like I said, this would be far more likely the place where you would see streets with businesses and so on and so forth being like right in front of these buildings, like these down here, that you might call something like just a various different kinds of mill buildings, like the ones that we saw in that. I've got the 3D on right now. Very similar to that. They don't have the exact roofs that you might see. And like I said, these ones do. And like I said, oh look, there's a Lafarge right there too. Lafarge, so they're the biggest name in cement. What used to be Alpina Cement is now Lafarge. Yep. So there's a lot of business out here. I mean, more than just inland steel. But, you know, like I said, this would be a place where you would see more here. Houses and stores and streets and, you know, things like that. And you could look across and you might see a street like that. And then you might see these large mill buildings. And especially over this way. Yeah. You've got a lot of homes out this way. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of these streets, like the street that we saw in that, are kind of here, pretty close. I doubt the same sort of wall that we looked at would exist. And there's no way that you would be seeing towers like, you know, the city. Just not going to happen. You have big structures back here. You have these different chimneys, and you have remnants of a lot of things that they've just torn down or partially torn down. But as I say, almost nothing is going to be the sort of size that we're seeing in the background there, nor do I see it oriented here. Now, that being said, it's absolutely possible, of course, that I made a mistake. And if anybody can realize that mistake, the nature of it, let me know. But one more time, full screen, back this up just a little bit, and I want you to look at the size of that thing in the background, because it's impressive.
Composed of women. At Indiana Harbor, streets are lined with idle work.
Just look at that. What on earth is it? You could argue a smokestack, which I don't know what you're going to argue all that would be. That looking too thin to be a chimney. Very interesting. Just to see a structure of that size and height. Because these buildings are huge buildings. These are huge buildings. And they are far, far behind the street scene that we're looking at right now. These are way, way in the distance. They're that big. These buildings are really, really big. And then to see something that large, even so, behind these really big buildings. Really interesting. So yeah, as I said, this one was just going to be a little bit crazy. It's an hour and 45 minutes now, and I'm not cutting it down. So, you know, there you go. It's not so brief. It's the not so brief today. And that's what I got. And so, you know, maybe some things to think about. I'll see you next time.